So Leslie talked primarily about explicit collusion as a merger concern. And I'm going to argue that there's a spectrum of behavior that one might want to call coordinated effects. And that spectrum is sketched in the US Horizontal Merger Guidelines from 2010. And I'm going to focus primarily on the opposite end of that spectrum from what Leslie focused on. So I'm aware that this became somewhat controversial in some circles a few years ago. As with UPP, I sort of hope that things have calmed down at that level, but maybe not. I'm going to argue that it's something of an unnecessary classification dispute, and the key point is to not ignore the way oligopolies work in thinking about mergers. And subject to that, there's actually a lot of flexibility in how one handles the issue. So what are coordinated effects, and should you care what coordinated effects are? So here is my experience with how oligopolies often work. The kinds of fairly concentrated oligopolies that we tend to worry about mergers in. And by that I mean not the oligopolies that we would be most horrified by mergers in, but the ones where we find the decision a little bit problematic. Okay? Very often I've learned of such oligopolies that, as far as one can tell, there's nothing that we can see that is explicit collusion, and there's nothing we can see that I would call tacit coordination. And what I mean by that is there's no plan in anyone's head. There's no common understanding of where they're trying to get to. There's no scheme whose goal is to punish deviations. But each firm keeps an eye on the others, responds when its competitive environment changes. Often those responses are accommodating or matching to some degree. So when your rival cuts its price, you'll probably feel moved to cut your price too. Not to punish them exactly, although you're not unhappy at the fact that it punishes them, but because once they've cut their price, you have an incentive to cut your price, otherwise you'll lose a lot of business to them. The fact that there are these responses often is going to seriously affect incentives for those competitive moves. This is reality in a lot of oligopolies. So my strong bottom line from this is reality, so merger analysis should not systematically deny it. That's really all I want to say, but I'm going to have to expand on that a little bit. How do you not deny this reality? So what does the economics literature do when faced with this reality? The economics literature, almost all of it, bifurcates into two rich and enormous strands of work. This is primarily theoretical. The empirical work is a different story. So the first and perhaps most familiar, well, the first is an extensive study of static Nash equilibria, either Cournot or differentiated product price setting, typically. Okay? Sometimes involving some other variables like advertising and product quality and goodness knows what. And especially if you go back to the 80s, you can find a wide variety of these models, but fundamentally they're about static Nash equilibria. Okay? That methodology denies the kind of competitive dynamics that I was talking about a minute ago. Sometimes that won't be a very big deal, sometimes it will be a very big deal, but that's what it does. And by the way, let me just say that the term reaction function in the technical analysis of Nash equilibria is a misnomer that can mislead people in this respect. The fact that we use so-called reaction functions to calculate the Nash equilibrium does not mean that the reactions I was talking about are incorporated into the Nash equilibrium. The second strand is an extensive study of infinitely repeated game models. And the main theorem in that category of games is that there's a gigantic multiplicity of equilibria. And within that multiplicity of equilibria, most of the literature focuses on what is in some sense the most cooperative subgame perfect equilibrium, or sometimes other refinements are used for the players, that is for the firms. That way of analyzing an oligopoly resonates very much with ideas about coordination, detection, and punishment, because that's the way that we apply the test for whether or not there's a subgame perfect equilibrium, or if we take a somewhat grander view of it, whether you can achieve a collusive outcome in an incentive-compatible, individually rational mechanism. But that doesn't have to mean that those activities are necessarily going on, or necessarily going on in a way that we could point to in the documents or in anybody's head. Okay? A third strand, much sparser, although with a very high average quality of authors, is the sparse study of Markov perfect equilibria in repeated games. There are 3 articles by Maskin and Tirole. There are a handful of other articles. There's also a literature on conjectural variation that is often subject to insult, that I think is perhaps justified at a fussy theoretical level, but they should be cut a little more slack. That's about the kind of oligopoly behavior that I was talking about. So in Maskin-Tirole, what happens is you have alternating moves, and each of your moves bind you to a price or quantity for 2 periods. So for one period, you are reacting to the other guy's move, and for another period, he's reacting to your move. And even Maskin and Tirole appear unable to solve the case with more than 2 players. So it's a difficult literature, but at least it captures the idea that that kind of thing is consistent with entirely kosher game theory, and I think that's a major achievement, because it ought to rehabilitate the conjectural variations literature in a way that I think would be productive. So, how does the framing of everything other than static Nash behavior as coordination, detection, and punishment affect antitrust discourse? I've put up here 4 somewhat paraphrased, partly through imperfect memory, statements that I've heard people make in antitrust discussions of coordinated effects. These firms don't like each other, so they won't get together to agree on anything. Might be true, but that doesn't mean you won't have reactions that affect competitive incentives. Punishments are ex post irrational, so they probably won't happen or be believed in ex ante. Notice that that defines away as not being a punishment the kind of Markov reaction that I was talking about and that Maskin and Tirole talk about. You have to use a static Nash model unless you're accusing firms of colluding, which is a very serious accusation. Well, that really is denying the oligopoly dynamics that we see in most merger investigations, in my experience. You can't have both unilateral and coordinated effects. Either firms are coordinating or they're not. Well, a unilateral effect is, in my mind, a shift in the merging firm's reaction function. A coordinated effect is something other than that. You can have both of those things going on. But the main point is we shouldn't be at the level of discussing whether statements like this are true or false. We should be rising above them and studying what's happening in the oligopoly and how the merger affects it. Okay, so how do you fix this if you agree with me that it's something that needs to be fixed? Well, what you need to do is to create and protect some sort of space where normal, non-collusive oligopoly dynamics that might affect competitive incentives, and typically do, can be discussed in merger review. Okay? In the US merger guidelines context, we believed that coordinated effects was a pretty good place to do that. And that's why they're in Section 7. Parallel accommodating conduct is in Section 7 of the 2010 merger guidelines. Okay? One reason why we thought that was a good place was the defining sentence that we took, copied and pasted from the 1992 merger guidelines about what coordinated effects are. And I didn't bring my copy of the guidelines, but I will try to quote it from memory. Coordinated effects are actions by firms that are profitable only because of the accommodating reactions of other firms. Okay? Now, if somebody wants to put the kind of spontaneous dynamics that I've been talking about into unilateral effects and say it's not about agreements and detection and punishment, it's about individually selfish behavior, and so it's unilateral, okay, that's fine with me, put it in there, but then don't say that unilateral effects is purely about static Nash. Just put it somewhere. A third place would be okay with me too, but please don't ignore it or define it away. Okay? What do we look for? Well, this is sort of a return to the past in a way, because the things you look for are largely the same things that you might have been looking for anyway, with acknowledgement to Leslie's points. If you're going to look for parallel accommodating conduct to have a big impact on incentives to cut or raise price, you're going to be looking for your rivals to observe those facts. You're going to be looking for them to have an incentive to respond to it, or at least which would resonate with not minding the idea of responding strongly to it. And so you're going to be looking for somewhat the same factors. Okay. Let me skip over that slide because I don't want to focus it on a speaker who's not here. But I think there is an issue, a substantive issue, which is how much in thinking about coordinated effects of mergers should we focus on the kind of explicit collusion that is illegal under Section 1 of the Sherman Act or Article 101 here. And I think if we just think about it logically, the answer is that'll depend on whether you think most of the effects that we should be analyzing will take the form of explicit collusion. Okay? Leslie was arguing that sometimes tacit collusion can be quite difficult and quite ineffective relative to explicit collusion, and that's an argument that suggests that explicit collusion might be a large part of the problem. And if that's the case, then we should analyze the coordinated effects with a strong eye on the likelihood of explicit collusion. If you think of tacit coordination as often more effective or easier to do, less deterred than explicit collusion, then you want to analyze it somewhat differently, because as many people have pointed out, explicit collusion might in fact tend to happen where exactly where tacit coordination is most difficult. Right? That's where you would feel willing to incur the prison risks and so on. If you want to analyze parallel accommodating conduct, you probably don't want your analytical framework to be the same one as you would use for the presence of explicit collusion. So, do I have a few minutes to talk about beer? All right. Coordinated effects in beer. I recommend to everyone interested in antitrust, which I hope includes everybody in this room, reading some of the documents, particularly the Department of Justice complaint in the $20 billion Anheuser-Busch InBev purchase of Modelo that was recently settled. It was a number one player in the US beer market buying a fast-growing number three, if I remember correctly. DOJ's view was that Modelo, number three, was the key limit on leader-follower conduct in pricing that would otherwise threaten to raise prices even more than they have been going up. And DOJ found and quoted a number of very fascinating sounding documents on the Anheuser-Busch conduct plan, which DOJ described as a manual for price leadership, and Anheuser-Busch talked in this plan about how to be an effective price leader and get others to follow your price increases. That ran headlong into Modelo's momentum plan, which was their strategy of not matching the price increases, and therefore, since they had, and therefore gaining in market share. Okay? Now, is this a coordinated effect? Is it a unilateral effect? My first answer is I don't really care. We shouldn't be focusing on trying to divide unilateral effects from coordinated effects. We should be focusing on whether there really is an effect. But if we want to get into it, I would call it a coordinated effect because it's about how firms' reactions affect one another's incentives and how that changes with the merger. And how did it change with the merger? It changed with the merger because although Modelo proposed to divest its US brands to Constellation, which had been its joint venture partner in an outfit called Crown, DOJ's view was that those brands would be less powerful, have higher costs, and be more beholden to Anheuser-Busch post-merger and divestiture than pre-merger and divestiture. There was some fascinating analysis of Constellation's incentives within the joint venture relative to Modelo's incentives within the joint venture, and that's part of why I recommend reading the document. DOJ ended up accepting a revised remedy that strengthened, in their view, Constellation's ability and likelihood of resisting price leadership from Anheuser-Busch. But the aspect that I wanted to stress in this presentation is there's a real interaction of coordinated and unilateral analysis. If you agree with me that the fundamental theory DOJ was putting was a coordinated effect, it's about how reactions change and how that affects equilibrium prices, but it's mediated, the change is mediated through a unilateral type analysis. How does the post-merger and divestiture Modelo brands differ from the pre-merger and divestiture Modelo brands? And I think that kind of interaction of unilateral and coordinated analysis is more common than a lot of people think. And I wouldn't want any kind of attempt to rigidly divide them one from another to get in the way of that sort of integrated analysis. Thank you.